Chapter 2, Vault 717. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. October 23, 2077. 3:42 a.m. The air smelled of static and wood smoke. Downtown was quiet, too quiet for a city that still claimed over 70,000 residents. The streets weren't empty yet, but they moved like molasses. People walked faster, eyes darted longer, conversations cut shorter. Every television still played the same all-clear bulletin. Every emergency broadcast repeated the same lie. We are not at war. But everyone knew. The lie had run out of road. At the edge of the city, beyond the still glowing neon of East King Street, Vault 717 sat hidden beneath a converted textile mill. Officially, it was a research annex. Unofficially, it was a control vault. Not clean, not cruel, just observed. Inside, technicians moved without speaking. Final checks. Power readings. Population status boards scrolling through names. Eshelman, Bradley. Fink, Marla. Rodriguez, Kellen. Nguyen, Lacey. And hundreds more. Every one of them selected. Not random. Never random. Vault 717 was built to hold 1,000. It had room for 800. They planned it that way. In the city, the tension was liquid. In diners still open after midnight, waitresses handed out coffee refills like they were giving away hope. On side streets, families packed cars in silence. Some thought they had time to drive. They didn't. Some waited for military convoys that would never arrive. Others just stared at the sky. At 4:11 a.m., Lancaster's emergency alert system activated. The sirens didn't scream like the movies promised. They pulsed. A dull, mechanical thrum that echoed through the alleys, across the courthouse square, up the walls of Franklin and Marshall College. No announcement. No context. Just the sound. And that's when the city moved. A long convoy formed across South Duke Street, dozens of pre-registered families who'd received the Vault Tech letters. Some arrived early. Some arrived in shock. Some hadn't slept in 3 days. One man, in a press suit, stood with his daughter and repeated over and over, "It's just a drill. They said we'd get a real message first. They promised. They promised." No one answered him. Because just then at 4:26 a.m. the sky blinked orange. To the south. Far off. Over Maryland. Then again. Then again. One woman screamed. Most didn't. They just walked faster. Inside Vault 717, the heavy gears engaged. The inner door rotated for what might be the final time. Overhead lights buzzed in a low golden hue. The speaker system gave one last message in that soft, corporate Vault Tech voice. Please proceed in an orderly fashion. Vault 717 welcomes you to your new future underground. Children cried. Teenagers filmed it. Old men stood still. And then the thunder rolled in. 4:39 a.m. A detonation. Not in the city center. Too small for that. But close enough. A nuclear device, likely low yield, likely a misfire or intentional. Dropped outside Quarryville. The horizon turned white and then black. The blast flattened a strip of old farmland and silenced the power grid across the eastern half of the county. Lancaster saw the light, but only felt the quake. Buildings cracked. Windows shattered. Alarms failed. Sirens died. The city trembled. But it still stood. The last ones into Vault 717 ran. Some left family behind. Some turned back too late. One man was shot when he tried to force his way in with falsified clearance. The guards weren't government. They were Enclave provisioned Vault Tech assets. They shot clean. No hesitation. At 4:51 a.m., the outer vault door sealed. 824 people inside. One final siren faded into silence. And Lancaster City red brick and rust, neon signs, and carved stone fell quiet. The bombs kept falling elsewhere. Philadelphia. Gone. Harrisburg. Glass. Baltimore. Crater. But Lancaster? Lancaster burned slow. The edges of the county were charred to cinders. Shock waves rattled the spines of its stone bridges. Ash fell like snow over Amish farmland. But it lived. Damaged. Haunted. Scorched. But not erased. And beneath it, in cold steel and humming light, Vault 717 settled into its long watch. The experiment had begun. And somewhere inside, a boy named Bradley sat in silence. Listening. Waiting. Changing. The people of Vault 717 never stood a chance. Not because of bombs, but because of a clipboard. Tucked inside a steel briefcase labeled Project Luminary, the outline was chilling in its simplicity. A single-page summary, watermarked with both Vault Tech and Enclave insignias, read like it was written by a machine. Objective: determine post-radiological psychological and physiological evolution in juvenile subjects exposed to FEV-influenced biospheres under isolation. Method: separate all subjects under age 16. Relocate to Section D, Dark Side. Inhabit in total light deprivation aside from controlled UV exposure. Introduce FEV-laced luminescent fungal substrate to simulate long-term adaptive biosymbiosis. Observe. Notes: parental contact strictly forbidden. Emotional instability encouraged. Status: approved. Arcline, Enclave Oversight Node 3. October 24, 2077. 9:14 a.m. The world was gone. And deep underground, the vault had settled into a grim hum of procedure. Without warning or ceremony, the children of Vault 717 were gathered. They were told it was a safety protocol, a quarantine, a necessary adjustment due to atmospheric destabilization. But what they were led into was no medical wing. It was the dark. Section D was always part of the vault's blueprints, but no one ever talked about it. It didn't appear on the orientation maps. There were no nameplates. The door into the section bore only one sign: authorized research access only. Eyes adjust with time. The children were ushered inside by figures in full biohazard suits. No explanations. No comfort. No goodbyes. 11-year-old Bradley was one of the first. His mother screamed. She tried to fight the guards. They sedated her. He watched as the door sealed behind him, hydraulic locks hissing into place. And then, darkness. The fungi glowed. Soft blue and pale green. It pulsed on the walls like it was breathing. It covered every surface: ceiling, floor, pipes, even the bedding mats rolled out in uneven rows. It was mesmerizing. The kids were scared at first. Huddled together. Whispered questions. Silent crying. Then they saw the lights. Not lights. Bulbs. Long, flickering UV tubes hanging from the ceiling like dead vines, buzzing faintly in colors that didn't exist before the war. The light didn't feel right. It ached in the back of your head if you stared too long. It made your teeth itch. And everywhere, the fungus. Bioluminescent. Gentle. And completely soaked in a mutated strain of FEV1 that didn't infect like a virus, but waited. Waited for the right host. The right chemistry. The right age. And so the waiting began. Bradley didn't cry. He sat alone, his knees pulled up to his chest, watching the others. Some of the older kids, 13, 15, tried to act tough. Told stories. Tried to turn it into a game. But they didn't sleep well. The dreams came quickly. Things in the walls. Eyes inside the fungus. A voice beneath the hum of the UV bulbs. Bradley saw it too. Felt it. The pulse of the room. Like it was listening. Days passed. Or weeks. It became impossible to tell. There were no clocks. Only the cycles of UV flicker, and the rise and fall of the glow shrooms, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer. Feeding off the children's breath, their fear, their growth. Food came from the walls. A dispenser. Slop. Nutrient-rich and tasteless. Water tasted faintly metallic. It shimmered with a faint tint like it remembered something. Some kids stopped eating. Others started talking to the walls. And still, no one changed. Not at first. Then came the whispers. Low at first. Impossible to tell who started them. Maybe it wasn't anyone. Just voices between voices. Some children developed light sensitivity. Their pupils stopped shrinking under the UV. Others stopped sleeping entirely. And Bradley, he started hearing names he'd never been told. Names of vault staff. Of rooms he'd never seen. Names of people long dead. When he touched the fungus, it pulsed with memory. The experiment was working. Just not the way Vault Tech expected. The FEV strain in Vault 717 didn't cause immediate mutation. It wasn't about physical change. It was about neural rewiring. About symbiosis. About seeing in the dark. About becoming the dark. And through it all, the Enclave watched. Logs recorded pulse rates. Brainwave patterns. Infrared footage of children staring directly into cameras they couldn't possibly see. And they smiled. Because Project Luminary wasn't about survival. It was about awakening something new. Something that remembers pain as light. Something that feeds on memory. Something that starts as a child. And ends as something else entirely. No one knew what the voices were. No one knew where the memories came from. Not the children. Not the vault staff. Not even the Enclave. That was the most terrifying part. Because this wasn't just another control experiment. It wasn't just social stress or neural reconditioning. Project Luminary had gone off script. And it was working too well. By the second week, if it was the second week, names began to vanish. Not spoken. Not erased. Just forgotten. Kids stared at each other and saw strangers. Friends they'd arrived with now looked unfamiliar. The boy who once clung to his older sister couldn't remember he had one. The girl who cried for her dad no longer remembered what his voice sounded like. Some wrote their names on the floor in chalk from the meal kits. But every morning, the chalk was gone. So were the names. The fungus grew thicker and brighter. Where it once gently glowed in soft pulses, it now shimmered like water-disturbed colors that didn't match any earthly spectrum. The spores hung in the air like snow, never settling. You couldn't breathe without inhaling them. They weren't toxic. They were invasive. They didn't kill cells. They learned them. Talked to them. Rewrote them. Bradley had stopped speaking days ago. His voice didn't feel like his. He could still think, at least he thought he could. But the thoughts didn't always feel like they belonged to him. He knew what Vault 717's Eastern Turbine looked like. He knew the names of two technicians he'd never met. He knew a code that turned off the cameras in one corner of Section D for 4 minutes and 19 seconds. No one told him these things. He just remembered them, and then forgot he remembered. They began calling it the gray drift, what the kids whispered to each other between fits of silence and paranoia. It was more than just memory loss. It was identity erosion. Kids would wake up, stare at their own hands, and not recognize them. Some stopped using pronouns. Some forgot how to cry. Some forgot they were people. They didn't panic. They just adapted. That was the real mutation. The FEV didn't turn them into monsters. It unfolded them. Like blueprints. Like ancient copies of something older than humans ever deserved to be. By the third cycle of UV dimming, the whispers had taken on tones. Not voices anymore. Chords. The air resonated with subtle hums. Like choral notes from throats that had never learned how to speak. The children heard them not with ears but with bones. The vibration of identity being tuned like an instrument. Some began responding. They turned toward blank walls. Whispered answers to questions no one asked. And the fungus grew brighter. In the observation booth, miles of steel and silence above them, Vault 717's overseer recorded a final log. Subjects are exhibiting total cognitive dissociation. We've lost 91% of retained language comprehension. Emotional empathy between peers is degrading, yet aggression levels remain low. They are becoming something else. This isn't amnesia. This is overwriting. No one could stop it. And deep in the center of Section D, in a chamber where no cameras worked, the walls had started to breathe. The fungi were spreading up into the vents now. The UV bulbs were dimming, flickering, one by one. And the children? They weren't afraid. They sat in circles. Hands clasped. Eyes open wide. Pupils swallowing the light. And one by one, they started to hum along. They no longer remembered who they were. But something else did. Something in the dark. Something that fed on memory. And sang in the voice of forgotten futures. Project Luminary was a success. But what it had birthed wasn't human. They weren't supposed to die. That wasn't in the protocol. Project Luminary's notes outlined adaptive mutation, gradual neural rewriting, even identity erosion, but not this. Not the way little Jonah's eyes rolled back while whispering to a vent. Not the way Mara simply stopped moving, breath still steady, but her brain waves flatlined. Not the way Ava stared at her own hands for hours before walking into the dark part of the fungi grove and laying down forever. The logs called it cognitive oversaturation. The vault staff called it terminal drift. They were losing the children. But then, he changed. It started subtly. Subject 7-17 Bra. Formerly Bradley Eshelman. 11 years old. Healthy. Moderate asthma. IQ average. Nothing remarkable. His file labeled him as a quiet creative, strong attachment to mother, tendency to withdraw under stress. But now, he didn't blink like the others, didn't mumble or whimper, didn't respond to the gray drift. He watched. His movements became precise. His posture changed. He walked slower deliberately, like he'd forgotten what fear was. The fungus moved away from him. The spores drifted toward others but gave him space. At first the staff thought it was a data error. Then they checked the biometric logs. Heart rate, 58 BPM. EEG, active. Unstable. Violent alpha bursts. Blood oxygen, normal. Gene structure, incongruent. He wasn't mutating. He was resetting. Or worse, replacing. They pulled him from the dark. Full team. Full gear. Immediate retrieval. Subject 7-17 didn't resist. Not at first. They brought him to the medical wing, strapped him to the neuroframe, ran scans, blood tests, cognition baselines. But what came back made no sense. Language comprehension, 0% English. Emotional recognition, confused aggression. Response to spoken name Bradley, none. Pain tolerance, off the charts. Verbal vocalization, unknown dialect. Possibly not a dialect. Then the screaming started. Not from pain. From him. Screaming words no one understood. Sounding like numbers, or names, or commands. He thrashed. Tore the bindings. Bit one of the techs through their suit. Snapped a containment rod clean in half. They sedated him with 3 doses of class 5 neural suppressants. It barely worked. They didn't try to communicate. They didn't ask what had happened. They just threw him back into the dark. When he woke up, the hum had changed. It was quieter now. Like the fungi had grown still to hear his breath. Children no longer sat close to him. Some still whispered. Some stared at walls. But none approached. He sat with his knees to his chest again. Like he used to. But this time, he wasn't crying. He stared at the glow on his hands. Watched the spores dance around his fingers. And then, for the first time in what might have been months, he formed a thought. Not a memory. A question. Who am I? He didn't ask it out loud. But the walls heard him. And from the depths of Section D, something answered. Not in words. Not in sound. But in a memory that wasn't his. A face. A name. A vault. A door that never closed. And a world made of fire and silence. Whoever he had been was gone. And whoever was in there now was waking up. The others were not so lucky. while Bradley or whatever was inside him now sat in the dark with questions stitched into the hollows of his skull. The rest of the children began to change in ways even the Enclave hadn't dreamed possible. The mutation didn't come in a flash. It didn't roar or scream or shatter bone like the old FEV horror stories. It crept. Soft. Gentle. Inevitable. First, the eyes. Pupils dilated into vertical slits. Not feline, something else. They stopped blinking. Stopped flinching. Light didn't hurt them anymore. Then the skin. Pale. Then pale green. Then translucent in places. Veins that glowed faintly under UV, like circuits instead of blood. Fingers lengthened, too many joints, the kind of motion that looked wrong even in shadow. But the worst was what happened to the minds. Not gone. Not completely. Just drifting. They forgot how to speak. Forgot how to recognize each other. Forgot how to be human. They stopped forming groups. Started forming clusters. Sleeping on the walls instead of beds. Staring upward for hours. Drinking condensation directly from the fungi stalks. Eating it, too. And the fungus let them. It curled around them when they rested. Coiled up their spines like a mother's hand. Some were half buried in it, now fed by it. And in return, the children whispered its dreams. The staff above panicked quietly. Medical flagged 6 cases of advanced cognitive deconstruction. Security logged 3 biometric anomalies. One child, identified as subject 7-17 Mar, emitted a low-frequency tone from her throat continuously for 4 hours. It caused microfractures in the lab equipment. 2 observers vomited. She was sedated. She didn't wake up. But most of them didn't need sedation anymore. They weren't violent. Not in the way FEV subjects usually were. They were placid. Passive. Staring. Whispering. Watching things no one else could see. When one child began levitating spores with breath patterns, it wasn't even logged. The cameras above had stopped recording. Not from failure. From choice. The Enclave didn't want documentation. They wanted results. And the results were clear. Project Luminary had produced a new breed of post-humanity. Silent. Obedient. Not driven by hunger or dominance, but by pattern. They responded to light. To tone. They mimicked each other perfectly. Their neural networks had become communal. The scientists whispered the term behind the glass. Hive cognition. They had lost their memories, but not their purpose. They were becoming something else. Something together. But Bradley didn't fit the pattern. He was awake. Too awake. He didn't join their clusters. Didn't hum their tone. Didn't sleep under the spores. He watched. and in his eyes, there was still fire, still individuality, still resistance. That made him dangerous. That made him wrong. But the others didn't attack him, didn't reject him. They simply circled him, waiting, as if they knew whatever he was becoming was meant to lead them. But lead them where? Even he didn't know yet. All he had was the question, echoing louder now. Who am I? And beneath that, another voice, older, colder, whispering from the deepest part of the dark. You were not born here. You were built. And now, it's time to wake up. The darkness pulsed when he spoke. Not metaphorically, literally. The air itself recoiled like a lung gasping. The spores hanging in the black, the bioluminescent threads clinging to the curved steel walls, the once children gathered in silent communion, they all froze. Not in fear, but in uncertainty. Bradley, what was left of him, had not surrendered. His body trembled under the strain of months of slow-motion psychological death. His limbs were thin, twitching. His hair had grown out into a greasy tangle. His fingernails were blackened from the mold. His skin bore a faint ultraviolet sheen in certain angles. But behind the haze, behind the slow encroachment of the hive's wool, Bradley was still there. And now, he was screaming. I don't know who you are, or if you're even real. But one thing is damn certain. When I get out of here, when I escape, I'll come back. One day. And I will kill every last one of you. From Vault-Tec to these damn spores. It might be years from now. I might not even remember where the hell we are. But I will stop this. You will not control me. His voice cracked, raw from disuse. The air afterward was so thick with silence it felt physical. The fungus dimmed slightly as if confused. The other children, those now half-merged, half-symbiotic, faces glowing with spore light and forgetfulness, turned their heads. Slowly. In unison. And blinked. For the first time in weeks, they recognized him. Not as one of them. Not as their alpha, but as a wound, an imperfect variable, a threat. Above, in the sealed vault control room, alarms flashed in amber. Biometric anomaly, emotional spike, cognitive reactivation. One Vault-Tec researcher, trembling with his hand over the abort switch, whispered. He's not adapting. He's fighting it. Another Enclave overseer, calm, surgical, replied. No. He's remembering. Keep him alive. Bradley collapsed to his knees, breath shallow but his own. The darkness around him still buzzed, still tried, but it couldn't finish what it started. Because it had touched something it couldn't assimilate. Will. His name. His pain. His hatred. All still there, burning cold and jagged like broken glass inside his skull. He didn't know where they were. Didn't know how long it would take. But one truth rang louder than the whispers. Louder than the hum of the spore chorus. Louder than the voice inside him clawing to reshape him. You will not control me. The fungus shifted, now retreating from him. It had tried to crown him. Tried to mold him into its messiah. Its alpha. But instead, it had forged something else. Not a king. A revenant. And deep in the dark, a plan began to bloom. Not the fungus's. His. One day, he would walk back through these tunnels. Older. Stronger. Maybe not even human anymore. But with one purpose, unbroken by spores, FEV, or fate. And this. Burn it all. Make them pay. And that day would come. Even if the world forgot his name, he wouldn't.